Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, the X-Men face their toughest challenge as one of their own becomes a Dark Phoenix. In 1992, the X-Men rescue the crew of the space shuttle Endeavour from a storm of cosmic energy, but during the mission, Jean Grey, played by Sophie Turner, becomes trapped on the shuttle and absorbs the energy inside her. She manages to somehow survive, but as the energy breaks down the mental barriers placed within her by Professor Xavier, played by James McAvoy, Jean's personality and powers start to become unstable and impulsive. As Jean is seduced by Vuk, played by Jessica Chastain, the leader of a group of shape-shifting aliens who want the energy to take over the Earth, Jean becomes a threat to not only the fragile peace between mutants and humans, but to the X-Men themselves. The X-Men film franchise has been around for a long time, 19 years, and in that period, it's given us some of the best comic book movies ever made, including X2, Days of Future Past, and Logan, and on its off days, it's given us some of the worst. It's never been a particularly consistent franchise, to say the least. I actually remember that I was too young to even see the first film in cinemas. I had to wait till it arrived on video, and by that I mean good old VHS. That's right, it's been around for that long. But this series has never been wholly terrible for all the bumps in the road. It's actually something of a trailblazer. It helped legitimize the comic book movie again after it was dented by all the terrible adaptations that were done in the 90s. You wouldn't have the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the DC films that we have now if it wasn't for the X-Men film series. It played an important, crucial role in this genre. So it is somewhat sad to say that this will likely be the last main X-Men film, given Disney's acquisition of Fox and all the Marvel properties that Fox still own, and so it's likely that the X-Men are going to be folded into the MCU and rebooted. Now, this isn't going to be the final Fox X-Men film. There's still the matter of the spin-off, The New Mutants, which is billed to come out next year after a string of reshoots, and frankly, who knows what's happening with that. But for all intents and purposes, Dark Phoenix is a last hurrah. I just wish that final one was much better than this. It's perhaps fitting the final main X-Men film is directed by Simon Kinberg, who may be making his directorial debut here, but has a long history with the Fox Marvel films, serving as a writer and producer on many of them, including X-Men Apocalypse and Josh Trank's Fantastic Four, but he started off in 2006 co-writing X-Men The Last Stand, the notoriously divisive would-be trilogy capper that tried to close off all the storylines from the first two Bryan Singer films. He was replaced by Brett Ratner on that movie, and do it within 100 minutes while simultaneously adapting the Cure storyline and the classic Dark Phoenix storyline as well. And generally fans didn't like that movie. It didn't think it did the characters or the storylines adapted justice, and Kinberg would probably agree with you. Apparently it was a very fraught, very rushed production, especially on the writing side of it, where he was having to deal with studio notes all the time. He had to fight for what we even saw on screen there. So it's understandable why Kinberg, given the opportunity, would try to adapt something that he's already done previously. He wanted to go back to Dark Phoenix and do it justice. That's not what happens here. And given that I've watched both The Last Stand and Dark Phoenix within the same week, I'm going to maybe hypothesize that perhaps the problem is Kinberg himself here. When it comes to adapting this story, it doesn't seem like he has very much imagination about it. The comic book storyline is a challenging one to bring to film because it's definitely one of those that plays towards the medium that it's in this intergalactic, and it's got cosmic stakes to it. And these movies both try to ground it onto Earth level for the most part, and that really doesn't work for it. It's something that you need to do on the grandest scale possible, and unfortunately, Dark Phoenix does not do that. In fact, it's so devoid of imagination that weirdly, it seems more like it's just copying The Last Stand. Kinberg is just recycling the material that he already done 13 years ago. The similarity between the two films is quite startling, even accounting for the fact they started from the same source material, if only loosely. So you've got dialogue in Dark Phoenix that hews very close to that of The Last Stand. You've got the establishment of the mental blocks that Xavier has put in Jean's mind that is in both movies and is taken from the comic books. It plays beat for beat identically for much of the first act, even in terms of visual iconography, especially when you get to the big set piece moment at the Grey House. In both films, they look fairly similar to each other and they play out in identical fashion virtually because they both culminate in the fatality of a major character. So they function in exactly the same way in the narrative. Dark Phoenix is actually probably doing it worse, because in the comparison between the two action set pieces at the Grey House, at least the one in The Last Stand was memorable and striking and impactful, whereas the one in Dark Phoenix feels like it's smaller scale and not particularly interesting in terms of its execution. This, unfortunately, is the problem that has plagued the X-Men film franchise in recent years. It's gone on for so long that's actually become something of a burden, because not only does it have a really tangled continuity, but also it's retreading ground it's already done before. And the whole point of clearing the timeline at the end of Days of Future Past was to give filmmakers with the young X-Men cast a chance to do things differently, to do the storylines that were done in previous films and make them right and go on and do different material. It essentially served as a reset button. It was meant to rejuvenate the franchise, and instead the last two made X-Men films, Dark Phoenix and Apocalypse, feel very much like retread, and Dark Phoenix feels redundant. It feels like we have been here all before, and unfortunately it screams of a series that has run out of creative momentum. Although even if Kinberg had a great script and was a good director, neither of which is true, he'd still be weighed down by the fact that his cast don't look like they want to be here. The other problem with the recent X-Men films is that the young cast simply feel like inadequate replacements. They don't have the charisma of their original counterparts, and also, as the series has progressed, it's become more and more palpable just how disinterested they are. This is especially true of Jennifer Lawrence, who looks like she's been imprisoned by the continued existence of this series. They got Jennifer Lawrence in First Class just as she was becoming an A-list actress, and now that she's a full-blown star, they've tried to accommodate her in the recent entries by expanding her role massively, but even she knows that she doesn't have to do these movies, and in this film and in Apocalypse, it's pretty obvious that Lawrence is just phoning in for the most part, and pretty obviously has her sights firmly set on the exit signage at all times, and to be honest, it seems like many of the cast are not far behind her. This is especially true of Nicholas Hoult, who also seems like he's very flat in this movie. It's perhaps not a coincidence that the ones that are most obviously lacking here are the ones that have to spend the most time in the makeup chair. It's ever more obvious how much they have to contrive ways of getting them out of that as much as possible. In Lawrence's case, it seems like the makeup for Mystique has really taken a backwards step here, mostly because it seems like Lawrence has demanded, okay, I'll come back for this movie if you make sure that I spend the least amount of time in the makeup chair you possibly can. But everyone else seems weirdly off here. It very much seems like everyone is threatened by contractual obligation, and maybe that comes across because a lot of the time the cast is simply told to act miserable. This is a dour, self-serious movie where the X-Men spend more time fighting amongst themselves than they do the villains. and it doesn't help that the script puts an enormous amount of pressure on its young cast, who we don't really have much of an attachment to and haven't been around all that long. For example, Sheridan's Cyclops has only been in this movie and Apocalypse, and is meant to sell the emotional heft of his relationship with Jean Grey that we've hardly seen in these movies. It's understandable why he'd buckle under that pressure, and given that we can't even see his eyes, he is incredibly wooden here, unfortunately. He's really bad. At least Kodi smit-mcphee is still doing a solid impression of Alan Cumming as Nightcrawler, but Alexandra Shipp is barely a presence as Storm, and Evan Peters as Quicksilver is totally squandered. He was a fan favourite character, but in this movie, he's barely utilised at all. It's like they decide, oh, you know what? This movie can't be fun, so we're not going to do another slowdown sequence. We're not going to put another spin on it. We're just going to try and write him out. He is in the first act of this movie, and then he gets immediately shuttled over to the sidelines with an injury that for any other character they would have got back up from, but for some reason incapacitates him until the very end of the film. Even the mainstay characters of Magneto and Xavier feel weak here. Michael Fassbender only pops up an hour into the movie, and even then it's the smallest role he's played out of any of the recent films. It seems like a tacit acknowledgement on Kinberg's part that there isn't that much to be done with the character they haven't already explored before, and Fassbender commits to it with his usual intensity because that's all the role genuinely requires of him. On the other hand, you have James McAvoy, who is weirdly shaky, in my opinion. The role of Xavier here is a lot darker, they make it a lot more complicated. These X-Men films always explore how power can be used. That's a major theme in them, and in this film's case, it's clear he is starting to get a little bit of an ego, that he is the one that is starting to take credit for everything, and he is the one that is making the decisions, both good and bad, and a lot of what happens in this movie is fallout from his decision to put those mental barriers in Jean Grey, which is hugely unethical. And unfortunately, McAvoy, even though he's given a fairly meaty part in this one that adds a new dimension to that character, it seems like the way he's directed is really inconsistent, and often McAvoy seems like he's stumbling into weird mannerisms in terms of his vocal performance. It's very odd. McAvoy is a great performer. Usually he's the most competent and professional out of the cast, and in this film he seems out of his element a lot of the time, not helped by the fact the movie tries to integrate him more into the action, and he spends much of the film being carried around by the other cast members. If there is a bright spot to this movie, it is Sophie Turner. Having essentially ascended up to the lead role, she is clearly giving this part her all. It's a substantial improvement on her performance in X-Men Apocalypse, which I thought was really weak. Here she embraces all sides of the character, the conflicts and the contradictions within her. She's a character that is surging with anger and power and insecurity and anxieties, and also the fact that there's various parts of her just fighting to come to the forefront. It's a much better written version of this character than it was in The Last Stand. In that movie, Jean Grey mostly just sat around on the sidelines when she wasn't asking people to kill her. Here, she's given a lot more to play, and she's given a lot more agency. It seems like she's in a bit more control of her powers and actually kind of enjoying it a little bit. So there is improvement on a story level, if not necessarily an entertainment level with the movie itself. The problem, again, is that Jean is not very well written in this movie, in that they use her impulsiveness as simply an excuse for her to just act in ways that seem illogical or not really making sense for the character. She keeps attacking police and military for reasons I can't entirely fathom, to be honest. And you've also got the Phoenix Force, which is represented as a big cloud in this movie, but otherwise The Phoenix part of her isn't all that prominent. It's not a split personality in this film. It's not two sides of Jean. It's Jean, and Jean when she gets angry, essentially. That, again, is not on Turner. She's not to blame for the writing. She's only playing what she's given, and I think that she does a good job considering just how inconsistent the script is overall given her characterization. It can't have been an easy role to play. There's also the matter of Jessica Chastain in a frankly terrible wig as the film's villain. She's the leader of a group of shape-shifting aliens called the Dabari. Fans of the original comic book continuity might recall that that's the alien race that lost their homeworld when Jean, as the Phoenix, destroyed it. She enacted genocide upon them. The film adaptation considerably waters that down by saying the Phoenix Force destroyed their world, and they're planning to use that force as a way of transforming the Earth into their new home world. They've been lurking undercover, and if that seems a little bit contradictory and not at all making sense, then that's only because these characters are included because they want to reference the original storyline, and also because they want villains, even though that was not how they functioned in the comic books. Chastain seems to be enjoying herself. She gets to vamp and be evil, but she can play cold in her sleep, and the aliens' abilities are not well articulated. In the climax of the movie, there are moments where they're taking hails of gunfire in the face and regenerating, but there'll be moments where they're fighting with the X-Men and they'll get slashed, or they'll have other human frailties and weaknesses, or there'll be moments where they get shot and fall down, and I go, what are their limits? I don't really know, and the honest answer is the movie doesn't care. It's just simply using them for cannon fodder. But the worst part of the movie is Simon Kinberg's direction. His inexperience is obvious at every stage. He has no idea what he's doing with a big level production like this. And so you've got a movie which is just terribly flat. Kinberg gives the material no personality whatsoever. There's no humour or character to it at all. It's a movie that's aiming for big emotional beats, and none of it connects with the audience. It rarely raises past the level of workmanlike, and sometimes it doesn't even get up to that. There are moments where he really flubs key scenes, like there's a moment where Jean is looking at Cyclops and nursing a bruise on his cheek that she gave him. What you should do in that scene is actually light the actor so that you can see the bruise. You can't see it because the scene's too dark. That's a good mark of just how out of his depth Kinberg is, and this is an event movie that doesn't have very much action in it at all, and what little there is not very memorable or well staged. It also feels weirdly cheap for such an expensive movie. It always feels like they're cost cutting a lot of the time. I'd imagine the budget is inflated by the huge amounts of reshoots, and in fact that reshoot, the whole train sequence, is the only real memorable action beat in the movie, and it comes at the very end of it. There's only occasional moments where the movie kinda splutters into life. There's a moment where Jean uses Xavier with her psychic powers that's kind of perversely twisted, and I'd imagine for some audiences that's an unintentionally hilarious moment, which it kind of is, to be honest, but you know what? At least that shows a spark of life, which is also rare in this film. Kinberg doesn't even make an effort with the 90s aesthetic. Aside from the title card, you'd be forgiven for thinking this movie was set now. Even in the previous X-Men film, they made more of an effort to integrate the eras into the production design. Apocalypse had more of the 80s in it than this film does of the 90s. It's that non-existent. And why do the recent X-Men films keep skipping a decade at a time? It's totally nonsensical. Like, why would you do that? All it does is confuse the timeline and the audience, particularly those that remember that the same cast that was playing these characters 8 years ago in First Class, which is set in the 60s, are still playing them now, even though 30 years have passed in movie time, and they should be approaching 50 to 60 years old, and they look like they're half of that. They're looking pretty good for it, to be honest. The movie also imagines a world where mutants are shakily accepted, which is an interesting concept, but it also has no interest in exploring that whatsoever. It pretty much just falls by the wayside, and also it downplays the fact that mutants are meant to be a metaphor for marginalised groups. That political commentary is again tried to be erased from the movie as much as possible. Again, so many interesting things about these characters are not apparent in this film. At least Hans Zimmer's score is fairly decent and brooding, but also it lacks superheroics. But I guess that kind of sums up the whole film in general. Dark Phoenix isn't the worst X-Men movie. This is a franchise that has plumbed the depths of X-Men Origins Wolverine, but it might be the most mediocre and the most unremarkable. I would take The Last Stand over this movie because at least that was entertaining. This feels phoned in. This feels like a series that has totally exhausted itself and needs a rest and some new blood. This franchise should have honestly ended with Days of Future Past and Logan. Those were perfect send-offs, in my opinion, and unfortunately, this is not. As someone who has been following this series for almost 2 decades, I was really rooting for this movie. I was hoping for one final good one, and unfortunately, no. Those hopes were very soon dashed, and as I was watching it, I was mostly just feeling sad. Not just because of the movie itself, but because of the circumstances around it. Dark Phoenix is tragic for all the wrong reasons. Dark Phoenix may not be the lowest point the long X-Men franchise has come to, but it is certainly an unworthy finale to a series that was once influential but has now slipped into irrelevance. A large part of the problem is Simon Kinberg, who in attempting to rewrite the storyline he previously adapted in The Last Stand doesn't really improve on it, given it is now the central focus, and even repeats ideas and visuals that only emphasises how redundant this feels. As a director, he helms the movie with no real flair, and the emotional impact falls flat, resulting in a film that feels light on action, excitement, or any real fun for the most part. That being said, it doesn't help that much of the cast here look like they can't wait for this series to be over and seem disinterested as they're underutilised, and even reliable members of the cast like James McAvoy are directed into surprisingly shaky performances. At least Sophie Turner playing the titular character seems fully invested and tries very hard as Jean Grey, despite the inconsistent material she's given. It's a very underwhelming, low-energy exit before the inevitable MCU reboot, which this movie functions as the greatest argument for. If you like this review, then you can use your mutant powers over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.